Welcome to this explainer. Today we're unpacking one of the absolutely foundational concepts in all of biology, the cell theory. When we think about massive scientific breakthroughs, it's so easy to picture a lone genius in a lab having this sudden eureka moment and just instantly unlocking the secrets of the universe. But, the truth is that science almost never happens instantaneously. It's a really slow, methodical process. It builds one single discovery at a time, often stretching across entire centuries. So today, we're going to explore how the literal rules of life itself were uncovered, piece by piece, in what was essentially this grand, multi-generational scientific relay race.
Okay, let's dive right into this. Science does not happen all at once. Cell theory definitely wasn't invented by just one person. It was carefully pieced together over the course of nearly 200 years. And understanding this massive 200-year history is absolutely crucial because it shows us not just what the rules of life are, but exactly why they had to be discovered in a very specific logical sequence. We really couldn't see the whole picture until we had the right tools and the right thinkers to connect those dots.
And we're talking about a massive scope here. We're starting way back in 1665 and running all the way up to 1855. 2 entire centuries of passing the baton from the 17th century straight into the 19th. Each of these 6 scientists, from British to Dutch to Scottish to German, held just one piece of the puzzle. They were separated by generations, but their combined work fundamentally changed how humanity understands life.
Section 1. Early microscopes, empty rooms. So, let's take Robert Hooke back in 1665, for example. He used a compound microscope of his own design to look at a super thin slice of cork. And when he looked through the lens, he saw these rows of small, box-like compartments. He actually named them cells because they reminded him of the small square rooms in a monastery, which were known in Latin as cella. But here's the critical catch. Hooke was only seeing the cell walls of dead plant cells. He was literally looking at empty rooms with no one inside. He had absolutely no idea that cells were the fundamental unit of life. Then, just 9 years later, Antonie van Leeuwenhoek, a Dutch cloth merchant, ground his own lenses, and his lenses were way better than anyone else's at the time. With his setup, he became the very first person to ever observe living microorganisms. He's looking at pond water and dental scrapings and seeing these little rods and spirals darting around. He called them animalcules, basically meaning tiny animals. But again, there's a huge blind spot here. Leeuwenhoek didn't think of these as cells. That overarching concept just didn't exist yet. So, you have Hooke, who saw the dead walls and totally missed the life, and Leeuwenhoek, who saw the living things but completely lacked the concept of a cell.
Section 2. The universal rule of life.
Let's see how this builds as we jump out of the 1600s and leap far ahead to the 1800s. The next major breakthrough happens in 1831 with a Scottish scientist named Robert Brown. Now, Brown was studying plant cells, specifically orchid root cells, and he noticed something that Hooke completely missed. Inside every single cell, there was this consistently darker, rounded structure. He named this structure the nucleus, which actually comes from the Latin word for kernel or nut. And this discovery was a total game changer. It was the very first time a specific internal structure of the cell had been identified and named. It completely proved that cells weren't just empty boxes or hollow monastery rooms. They actually had highly organized internal contents. So, armed with the knowledge that cells were these complex structures, 2 scientists finally put the big pieces together. In 1838, Matthias Schleiden, a German botanist, examined tons of different plant tissues and officially concluded that all plants are made of cells. The cell, he realized, was the basic unit of plant structure. He was the first to propose the cell as a universal structural unit, but his rule only applied to plants. Enter his close colleague, Theodor Schwann. Schwann was a German zoologist, and just 1 year later, in 1839, he extended Schleiden's groundbreaking idea to the animal kingdom. He concluded that all animals are also made of cells. Together, this dynamic duo combined their distinct fields of botany and zoology to prove that the cell is the universal, foundational building block for both plants and animals.
Section 3. Shattering spontaneous generation.
Okay, so we now know what life is made of, but we still have a massive scientific crisis on our hands regarding where life actually comes from. Before 1855, a lot of highly educated people firmly believed in this concept called spontaneous generation. This was the belief that life could just arise from completely non-living matter. I mean, imagine this. People actually thought that if you left a piece of meat out on the counter, maggots just magically generated from the meat itself. Or, even crazier, that mice simply appeared out of thin air from piles of grain stored in barns. For centuries, the explanation was that life just appeared whenever the conditions were right. But the modern truth, cell theory, states that every living thing traces back to an earlier living thing in a continuous, unbroken chain. To fully establish this, the scientific community needed a hammer to completely shatter the myth of spontaneous generation once and for all.
And that hammer arrived in 1855, courtesy of a German physician named Rudolf Virchow. Virchow was studying diseased tissues, and he noticed that they were entirely made of abnormal cells that had multiplied. Based on this, he proposed a truly revolutionary phrase, omnis cellula e cellula. It's Latin for every cell from a cell. So the absolutely crucial point here is that Virchow's statement completely destroyed the idea of spontaneous generation for cells. If every cell absolutely must come from a pre-existing cell, then life simply cannot arise from nothing. A maggot comes from a fly's egg. It doesn't spontaneously. Cell theory. You know, if we really want to understand life, we have to understand the foundational rules that govern it. And let's be clear, these aren't just educated guesses. They are confirmed, absolute laws that apply to every single living organism ever studied. So let's just jump right into it.
We're going to cover 4 absolute statements today. 1. Composition. 2. Operation. 3. Origin. And 4. Heredity.
All right, starting right off with number 1. Postulate 1. Composition.
This postulate states that all living organisms are composed of one or more cells. Now, I want you to read that with exam precision and really focus on that word all, because the word all right here is an absolute rule. There are 0 exceptions in the living world, literally none. To put the sheer scale of that rule into perspective, think about a unicellular organism, right? Like a single microscopic bacteria or an amoeba. That one tiny single cell is a complete, totally independent living unit. But then contrast that with multicellular organisms, like us. You have roughly 37 trillion cells currently working together in your own body. So whether we're talking about a lone bacteria or the billions upon billions of cells making up you, the fundamental building block is exactly the same. It is always a cell. So, a natural question comes up. What about viruses? Well, the crucial takeaway here is that a virus is not actually considered a living organism under this very strict definition. Why? Simply because a virus is acellular. It's just not made up of cells. And honestly, this exact rule is the specific reason why biologists are constantly debating the status of viruses and whether they actually deserve to be called alive. Moving right along to number 2, Postulate 2, Operation. Postulate 2 tells us that the cell is the basic structural and functional unit of all living organisms. Now, structural and functional are 2 incredibly vital words there. Let's unpack what they actually mean in practice. Structurally, it's kind of like a giant puzzle. Think of the cell as your basic structural brick. Cells bunch together to build tissues, right? Tissues build organs, and then organs build the entire organism. So structurally, if you reverse that whole process, if you disassemble any organism, any organ, or any tissue far enough, you will always eventually arrive right back at the cell.
Now let's look at the functional side of the equation, which is super fascinating. Every single biological operation you can possibly name, whether that's respiration, digestion, reproduction, or movement, happens exclusively inside of cells. There is absolutely no biological function that occurs outside of a cell. It is literally where life operates. Okay, number 3. Postulate 3, Origin.
Postulate 3 states, simply but so powerfully, all cells arise from pre-existing cells. Basically, no cell can just magically poof into existence from absolutely nothing. Spontaneous generation is completely impossible here. Every single cell has to come from a parent cell. Rudolf Virchow actually nailed this way back in 1855 with a famous Latin phrase, omnis cellula e cellula, which translates to every cell from a cell. I really want to impart the gravitas of this 1855 rule, because out of the 3 classical postulates we've covered so far, this one is definitively the most powerful. Think about it like this. When your skin heals after you get a paper cut, or when you watch a houseplant grow a brand new leaf, those new cells aren't just being created from scratch out of thin air. Instead, the old cells are dividing to make the new ones. Cell A divides to make cell B divides to make cell C, and it forms this continuous, unbroken chain of life. And okay, here is where it gets absolutely mind-blowing. If you take any cell, literally any cell in your body right now, and you trace it backwards through its divisions, you will eventually reach the very first cells on Earth, roughly 3.5 billion years ago. At the cellular level, life is a continuous, completely unbroken chain stretching all the way back across billions of years.
How crazy is that? Finally, number 4. Postulate 4, heredity. Postulate 4 states that cells contain the hereditary material of an organism, which is passed from parent cell to daughter cells during division. Notice how incredibly specific this is compared to the others. This rule specifically deals with the genetic instructions of life.
Now, there's a really interesting jump in the timeline with this one. The original cell theory, established back in the 19th century, only contained those first 3 classical postulates. But then the 20th century hit, bringing the absolute game changer, the discovery of DNA. This 4th postulate simply had to be added to account for how genetic information actually works behind the scenes.
So, when a parent cell divides, it isn't just splitting randomly. It's making a perfect, exact copy of its DNA, which ensures that every single daughter cell receives the complete genetic instructions. And why does this matter to us? Well, this exact copying is the literal cellular basis of heredity. It's the reason children look like their parents. And it's exactly why a liver cell and a skin cell in your own body share identical DNA, even though they look entirely different and do completely different jobs.
Let's zoom back out for a quick recap. Composition, operation, origin, and heredity.
You really shouldn't just read these as a random checklist. Try to view them as the sequence of life. 1. Everything living is made of cells. 2. Structure and function happen right there inside them. 3. Every single cell has a parent. And 4. Every cell carries the complete set of instructions forward. When you put them together, these 4 statements definitively define what it actually means to be alive at the most fundamental level.
So, I'm going to leave you with a bit of a challenge to test your mastery of this framework. Without looking, can you state all 4 postulates from memory? And do you remember which 3 were the original classical ones and which one was that crucial 20th century addition? Seriously, test yourself on this, because understanding these 4 rules means you understand the fundamental language of life itself. Thanks so much for joining me for this explainer, and keep learning.